Welcome to Revolutionary Gazette. My name's Jim, and I'm here to talk to you today about one of my favorite books, not only of the American Revolutionary War, but of all military history. I have a background in British history, and therefore it's my great pleasure to share with you today with Zeal and Bayonets Only by Dr. Matthew Spring, a book that I think finally does justice to the British soldiers and the British Army of the American Revolutionary War. It's a book which explores the efforts of the British Army both on a strategic and a tactical level during the American Revolutionary War. And when we think of the British Army today, back in the American Revolution, we think of men in powdered wigs, standing shoulder to shoulder in bright red coats, advancing in the open against American riflemen and being mown down. And nothing could be farther from the truth. The British Army that fought in America during the Revolution was one of the most effective fighting forces in the field at the time. They won most of the battles they were engaged in. They weren't there standing shoulder to shoulder. Most of the time, they would stay spread out until that very last moment where they would close in, fix their bayonets, and rush on the Continentals, driving them off the field. As someone with a background in British history, having gone to school over in the UK, I think this book does great justice to the men, their officers, and the overall strategy of the British Army during the American Revolutionary War. The British Army had been engaged in numerous rebellions throughout the 18th century, so they were well experienced with this. However, having to fight across the ocean on a different continent proved incredibly challenging to the structure of the army, constantly relying on the Royal Navy for their supplies, and having to deal with politicians back in the UK in Parliament and at court who had opposing views on how the war should be run. Some British officers, as well as their leaders, even believed in the American cause, though thought it was their duty to stay loyal in their place in the army. The British soldiers who fought in the American Revolution were incredibly professional, although many of them were coming from the lower classes and the middle classes of British society, as well as the many loyalists who ended joining the British Army during the war. They ended up being an incredibly effective force. You would see British light infantry battalions formed out of the various light infantry companies separated from their regiments, driving off American riflemen in numerous battles throughout the war, as well as the elite British grenadiers doing the same thing. Dr. Spring goes into several really interesting arguments, including taking the German soldiers serving in the British Army, who we often refer to today as Hessians, and comparing them to their British comrades. The Germans were known to be incredibly slow-moving in tightly packed formations, where the British consistently complained of outpacing them at battles such as Brandywine, where their marching pace was incredibly rapid, often a run. That comparison that Matthew Spring explores helps to show just how quick the British Army was in its actions on the battlefield, making a sharp return of fire before rushing on the enemy with their bayonets. In the end, tactical and logistical constraints hampered the British Army throughout the American Revolutionary War. They were entering territory that was sometimes held by a hostile population, sometimes lived in by a population whose loyalties they had no idea. They were able to effectively recruit loyalists at many points, and their war effort centered around loyalist population centers wherever they went in the colonies. Interestingly as well, Dr. Spring, in With Zeal and Bayonets Only, goes on to explore how there were different theories being argued in the British Army of how they were to operate. Following the great military leaders of the time, many British officers thought of following a German model after the Prussians and Frederick the Great, of that slow-moving but powerful force. Other British soldiers who had already served in North America during the French and Indian War, what many other countries called the 7 Years' War, said that, well, we should pay more attention to an American style of fighting. This loose style of fighting in trees, taking cover, moving quickly with light forces that really developed the British light infantry. In the end, they become a very effective force, and their experience here in America carries the British Army and their development of light infantry onwards into the French Revolutionary Wars and even the Napoleonic Wars. In the end, if you're interested in the American Revolutionary War from the British perspective, there's no better book that I would recommend than With Zeal and Bayonets Only, as again, it does that justice to the British war effort and clearly shows that the war and the combat that we think of in the American Revolution might not have been the stories that we've been told growing up. With that, thank you very much for joining me as we explored With Zeal and Bayonets Only. I hope to see everyone next time as we continue to connect our story today with the stories of the American Revolution. Thanks again. I'll see you next time with the Revolutionary Gazette.